Marbury versus Madison is a really complicated case, so I'll start with the reason it's important, then we'll fill in the gaps. Essentially, this case established the principle of judicial review, which means the Supreme Court can strike down unconstitutional laws passed by Congress. So, in this case, Congress had passed a law. The court then said that the law contradicted the Constitution, and so that law was struck down, meaning it would pretty much no longer exist. This case was the first time the court ever exercised its right to judicial review, where it strikes down laws, but it has been used many times since. By the way, you might already be realizing there's going to be a lot of information you need to retain for the exam. That's why I put together the 1-hour Supreme Court Cases Mastery Playbook. You can complete it while watching the video to get exam ready. Grab it through the link in the description and get started right away. Now's the time to fill in the significance point on the top line of this case's worksheet. I wrote Establish Judicial Review. This will help you quickly review the cases later during review sessions. So let's fill in the gaps to give you a little more understanding of this case. The law that Congress passed, which would later be deemed unconstitutional by the court, was a law that actually related to the powers of the court itself. But this is where it gets complicated. Essentially, before this law came into effect, the Supreme Court was following the constitutional law of original jurisdiction, meaning the Supreme Court was only allowed to hear certain cases first. All others must go before lower courts first. This included cases that involved ambassadors, cases that involved other public ministers and consuls, and cases where the states were a party, for example, if two states are suing one another. All other cases had to have already been heard by a lower court and were coming before the Supreme Court to appeal the lower court's ruling. Then, Congress passed a law, specifically Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, that increased the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. This law said that the Supreme Court could exercise original jurisdiction to issue writs of mandamus, which are orders telling government officials to do their jobs. This meant that people could come directly to the Supreme Court to have a writ of mandamus issued, and they didn't have to go to lower courts first. What we're about to see is that the Supreme Court said that a law adding items to their original jurisdiction was unconstitutional because the Constitution already clearly established what is and isn't original jurisdiction for the Supreme Court. But we're not there yet. First, you might be wondering who Marbury and Madison were. Essentially, the court was presented with a case where one man, Marbury, was issued an official appointment for a job by the outgoing president, John Adams. Adams had written, signed, and sealed the appointment on his last day in office. But the appointment letter was never delivered. The new president, Thomas Jefferson, then came into office and ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to send the document to Marbury. So Marbury went straight to the Supreme Court and asked them to issue a writ of mandamus forcing James Madison to hand over the document, which Marbury needed in order to officially take the job. So, suddenly we were in a situation where the Supreme Court was being asked to exercise the power that Congress had granted the court in the Judiciary Act of 1789. So, next the Supreme Court ruled that even though Marbury should get the job, they couldn't do anything about it because they didn't have the original jurisdiction, in this case, to issue a writ of mandamus. Essentially, the court said that the law Congress passed that would have allowed them to issue the writ of mandamus was unconstitutional, because Congress couldn't increase the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. Okay, so I understand this is a very complicated case, so let's pause and look at exactly what you need to know for this case. Remember, for the exam, you need to be able to explain the court's overall holding, which means what the court's final decision was on the case. Essentially, the court's holding was that a law passed by Congress was unconstitutional, meaning it contradicted the Constitution, and therefore it was to be struck down. This was the first instance of judicial review. That's the most important thing you need to know about this case. So next, you may need to be able to talk about the political principles at the heart of this law. There are two. First, this case established judicial review for the first time. Judicial review means the Supreme Court can say a law or government action is unconstitutional. This set the precedent for the Supreme Court to strike down many future laws that Congress passed, which the court found to go against the Constitution. Second, This case demonstrates the political principle of checks and balances. By striking down Congress's law, the court limited the power of Congress by saying Congress couldn't just create any law it wanted. All laws must be consistent with the Constitution. In other words, the court exercised its ability to check the power of Congress. Okay, let's look at a comparison to a related court case. In the exam, you'll be presented with the facts in one non-required Supreme Court case, and you'll be asked to compare it to one of the 14 required Supreme Court cases. Expect to be asked about a core principle or constitutional clause common in the two cases, and also how the holdings in the two cases are similar or different. Okay, so let's imagine you're asked to compare Marbury versus Madison to Loving versus Virginia. In the exam, you'd be given an overview of the non-required case. So, in Loving versus Virginia, you'd be told about a white man named Richard Loving and a black woman named Mildred Jeter, who got married in Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal. When they returned home to Virginia, they were arrested because the state had a law that made marriages between people of different races illegal. The couple argued that this law violated their basic rights under the Constitution, especially the right to equal protection and the right to marry the person you choose. The Supreme Court agreed with Loving and ruled that Virginia's ban on interracial marriage was unconstitutional. This decision ended all state laws that banned interracial marriage. So, the first thing you'll be asked in the exam is to identify the common core principle between the two cases. Here, the common principle is judicial review because both cases involve the Supreme Court striking down laws. Next, you'll be asked to identify how the holdings in the cases are similar or different. For this question, you might state that Marbury versus Madison found part of the Judiciary Act to be unconstitutional, and Loving versus Virginia similarly found bans on interracial marriage to violate the Constitution, so the similar holding was that the courts found laws to be unconstitutional. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you're following along with the 1-hour Supreme Court Mastery Playbook, complete the knowledge quiz for this case now, and have a go at the essay response task, where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Don't worry, you won't need to write the full response from scratch. You'll get to see a real completed response and fill in the blanks to help complete the free response answer.